Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's third edition of Women in Literature Festival. And I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome this amazing, distinguished panel of speakers. Today's session is the title, The Language of Grief, vis Dialectics of Freedom and Autonomy. And in this session, we seek to unearth the universality of the language of grief and melancholy. Grief is a common denominator in all human experiences. It is as universal as it is isolating, as collective as it is individualistic. Sweet sorrow is an age-old, wise companion to humanity. Unbeknownst to many, grief imbues the spirit of unity, albeit in the garb of verbal discomfort. This session centers on acknowledging grief as a universal phenomena and how different expressions of grief, especially on a linguistic level, can help us examine and process lived experiences. And with this, I'd like to introduce my panel. Naima Rashid is an author, poet, and translator. Her published and forthcoming books include Sum of Worlds by Yoda Press, Nolaki Koti by Penguin Random House, Chicani's Naima, let me know if I'm...
Chicanes, it's okay, doesn't matter.
Right. And Defiance of the Rose. Her writings have been widely published in journals of repute, including, and I cannot pronounce this word properly. Naima, could you please help me?
Asymptote.
Asymptote. The Scores, Wild Court, among others. Her work was longlisted for National Poetry Competition 2019 and Best Small Fiction 2022. She is a collaborator with the UK-based translation collective Shadow Heroes, which teaches young people to embrace all aspects of their linguistic and cultural heritage. Welcome, Naima.
Pleasure.
Safinah Elahi is a lawyer, novelist, and a poet. She has authored 2 books, a collection of poetry by the name The Unbridled Romance of Love and Pain, and the novel Eye on the Prize. Her next novel, The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon, is due to launch in July 2023 by the Neem Free Press, UK. She is also the founder of Reverie Publishers, which aims to guide the country's Anglophone emerging writers. She was officially nominated from Pakistan for the prestigious International Writers Fall Residency 2022 at the University of Iowa, where she participated as a fellow of the program. Welcome, Safinah. Sascha A. Akhtar is an ACE supported writer, translator, and educator. Over a span of 20 years, she has published 6 poetry collections and a collection of short fiction set in Pakistan entitled Of Necessity and Wanting. Akhtar has the distinction of being one of a handful of Pakistani women writing in English to be published in the experimental stream of UK poetries, a poetry school London tutor. Her work is widely anthologized and has been translated into Armenian, Portuguese, Galician, Russian, Dutch, and Polish. Her translations of the work of writer Hijab Imtiaz, the first female pilot in the subcontinent, will be published by Oxford University Press. Shazaf, so welcome, Sascha.
Thank you.
Shazaf Fatma Haider is the author of How It Happened and the prize-winning A Firefly in the Dark. She is working on her 3rd novel on marriage and divorce. She lives in St. Albans with her husband and 4 children. Welcome, Shazaf.
Thank you.
So I go back to the brief, and my first question is, grief being a common denominator in all human experiences, it is universal, isolating, collective, individualistic. Talk us through the nature of grief and why is it so hard to encapsulate and to describe its intensity, especially on a linguistic level. And I'll go with Naima first.
I'd say, Sabin, at a personal level, I feel that my biggest challenges have been around two areas. One is the making the decision to be vulnerable, making the decision to put the most hurting, raw parts of myself out to strangers who will become readers. And it struck me quite poignantly when my first poetry volume was accepted by Yoda Press for publication, which is forthcoming this year or the next. And last year in December, I was reading some excerpts from those poems at an event in London. It was a close poetry reading, and the room was full of strangers. Of course, there were other poets and musicians and artists, but they were strangers. And I was reading poems to them, and I was basically sharing things with them which I have never shared even with closest friends. And I choked on my words when I realized that what is it, why is it that I feel this is a safe space? I'm able to share this with strangers, but I've never had the courage to share it with friends. And that got me thinking about, is it a cultural thing? Because we have this notion of nazar, you can't share your joy, you can't share your grief. And so as a mechanism of protection, as a mechanism of keeping yourself safe, you learn at a very young age to bottle things up inside because you just don't feel that it's a safe space, whether it's relatives, whether it's family, whether it's closest friends, you just don't feel that safe space. And ironically, that was created in a strange new city in a group of strangers. And I felt perfectly safe doing that. I felt perfectly safe even crying in front of them because they were all doing that. And there was this unsaid covenant of understanding that, you know, this is a safe space. We are holding space for everyone to comfortably express grief. And I would say the second challenge in writing about grief or in expressing grief is that I would love to see what others say about this, but I feel that I can't write about it or articulate it unless I have processed it to some extent. While I'm still while I'm still processing it, it is practically impossible for me to trust anyone with it because it hasn't made sense in my head just yet. I would love to see what others say about it, if the mechanisms are better than mine.
Yeah, I'd actually really like to respond if that's okay, because I have been really in this same place as you, Naima, this sort of self-awareness. And you're standing, and actually it's taken me like 20 years to get there, frankly. Like recently, I've been feeling like, why have I been doing this? I've been spilling my guts out, to complete strangers. And but that is what I tell my students now is that, but that is the nature of poetry. Somehow it lends us, and I'm talking now about the poetry part of my work. It gives us a language with which to do this. So for me, it always came very naturally, and it was about healing. So I didn't know this myself when I first started as a teenager, so long ago. I never imagined I'd be actually publishing it. And the way it comes, it can be so raw, but then you work on it and work on it. And then before you know it, you're so vulnerable to everybody. It's echoing exactly what you're saying, Naima. But in my case, I was processing it through my writing. 100%, processing it through the writing. And there are things in it that even I wasn't aware of, because later, so years later, people have, they would say to me, there's so much sadness. There's so much sadness, And I think it really came to my attention when this woman just started bawling her eyes out at one of my readings, bless her, and it really makes you wonder. For me, I've reached this point now where I'm not sure I want to do it anymore.
No, but you must, because the healing that you get, you're transparent. You must. I also want to talk about genre. So I've been thinking about grief a lot because it is my father's death anniversary today. He died 14 years ago. And then I have been talking to two of my cousins who lost their son to suicide 5 years ago. So grief has very much been on my mind, not just the sadness, but the processing of it, because they're in a much better place. And it's the next project because I want to bring the voices of, they are warriors, and they are, I think they are saints, people who have processed grief and come out clean on the other side and transformed it into purpose. I feel very, and I don't know if you know Sabin Mahmood or you know of Sabin Mahmood, but her mother, if you are ever in her presence, you just come out stronger because she has been through a trial of fire, and she is that kind of person. And I do feel that grief is a gift. It is not a gift that I want, but it's a gift that I will experience. And
Shazaf, very beautifully put. I agree, 100%. Really beautifully put. Sorry, go ahead. I just want to.
Now I'm also 40 and I forget my train of thought. So now I forget. So like Sabine, yeah, I want to also say that poetry, I want to talk about genre. And I want to ask Safinah also, because I think poets have an extra edge over, I'm not a poet, I can't write poetry. But the thing is that prose writers, the parents who had lost their son, the father, koi kitab nahi padhi, nothing, no poetry, nothing. But he started writing poems upon poems and sending them to me. And he said, I know they're no good, but I need you to read them. I need you. So this process of him dealing with his grief and needing a witness to that grief. And I think poetry does that really well. And I think the poem that expresses grief and has always is he was my north, my south, my east, my west, or the Odin, stop all the clocks, prevent everything. It's not required. Life is meaningless. And I just don't think prose can do that. I think because that focus and that sharp focus on devastation or healing cannot happen, or it cannot happen in a novel, let's say. I don't know. Safinah, would you please disagree with me?
Thanks, Shazaf, for that. I personally feel that I think everyone has a different relationship to grief and rather a different reaction to grief as well. Some people take it privately. Some people sort of want to share their grief and loss. And linguistically, when I write about grief, because I do write a little bit of poetry, and most of my work, actually, the second and the third novel that I'm writing, both deal with grief and loss. And I feel like the characters, because they're fictitious, their reaction to grief, and every character's reaction is different. So, if there's a father, he has a different way of processing grief. The mother has a different way. The sibling has a different way. So one really finds, as a writer, one really finds herself conflicted because you feel like, am I doing justice to this voice? Am I going overboard? Because when the reader is reading it, at the end of the day, you want the reader to resonate with what you've put through, and you also want to create empathy, because, like Sabine said, it's a basic human, emotion. It connects people, and like you said, that it's a gift you wouldn't like, but it's a gift nonetheless, because you're the receiver of grief, and it comes to you in spaces and times where sometimes it shocks you, and you may be unprepared for it. But how do you deal with it with, maybe in poetry, it's some of your own grief, it's some of your own emotions, but when you're writing fiction, my first concern is, am I doing justice to the emotion of grief? Is it coming across as genuine? Am I doing it well? And I guess, you have to do it with a layer of sensitivity.
Just the fact that poem is that outburst of emotion recollected in tranquility, as Coleridge said, but it's an outburst and that's it. That is what the poet is giving you. I think that sort of connects to the heart much more than a novel can. I mean, I think that poets have a much more difficult job.
I've had people, readers who say that about poetry, some of even mine, because I do very, very short poetry. It's literally bursts of, like you said, sentences that come out, and, whatever trauma you've had in life, it just kind of spills on the page. And with poetry, you don't edit much.
Yeah, because haikus also, they kind of, it's like an arrow that pierces the heart and leaves you, and it doesn't sort of then, as a prose novelist, tell you, or a prose writer, not a prose novel, but a prose writer, tell you what to do with that. It says, here it is, I have felt it, I have connect with me, some, I don't know.
I
If
think,
I'm
and
Sasha?
I'll come back to you, Sasha. I think, and going back to Naima as well, when it comes to poetry and, you set it side by side with fiction. Fiction is like, the writer is like the director directing a movie. And with poetry, there's a rawness and vulnerability attached to it because it's coming straight from, it's raw and it's vulnerable, that the writer, that the poet herself or himself is, giving himself away, as opposed to fiction, where you have the story and you have the structure and everything. So maybe that is it. And Sasha, would you like to respond?
I just wanted to say that I think that this is related to so poetry as a vehicle for emotion. And yes,
Yeah.
I think when people are grieving, the reason they seek, and a lot of people seek out poetry. I've had people, ask me, what do you know? And you give them this one poem, like the Auden poem, Stop All the Clocks. It's like a nara, it's like a really drama and the emotion, and it helped me a lot with someone's death. So for the immediate emotion, poems like that. But then you have the with fiction, you have the novels that from the beginning to the end, they leave you breathless and gasping, and by the end of it, you are bawling your eyes out because it's a meditation on grief that extends. G?
An example of one.
ये example अब मैंने कह दिया, thinking in the back, but like, even things like Never Let Me Go by Ishiguro, like, things that are bathed and tinged, the whole environment is breathing grief, do you know? So this is my sort of answer to this a little bit.
Sabine, when you sent these questions and I was reading this question, I thought a lot about it. I said, is there any, when I experience it as a reader, or let's enlarge the scope here. If it's not just poetry or literature, music, dance, art. I was thinking as an experiencer, as somebody who was viewing it or reading it, in that role, in that capacity, I think if the work is well done, whether it's a painting, whether it's music, whether it's dance, I feel that there's no difference in how moving it can be. However, when you're creating, because I do write in different genres, I feel poetry has a particular advantage because in the way it condenses expression and emotion, and also in the way when you're writing poetry, the process of writing poetry, how much it has to do with flow rather than logic. I don't think you can suspend logic that much in other forms of writing. There has to be structure, and the structure has to be defined at the outset to some degree. But with poetry, your thoughts and your feelings are the structure. That flow is the structure. If your poetry is structured in the way you structure your novel, I don't think it can lead to very good poetry. The premise for good poetry is, freeing yourself from that obsession with structure. So that's what I thought.
But also sort of getting rid of all the excesses, right? Because whatever you have, you can't dabble. It's razor sharp poetry. I mean, I can't write it, but I appreciate it, and poems have healed me. And in a way that maybe I think novels have not. At that point, jab dil dukh raha hota hai, when your heart is hurting, nothing will do except a poem, nothing. Or rereading Auden, for example. And we're talking specifically about the death of a loved one, but what about the grief of a past life, of who you used to be, the grief of your children growing up and not needing you, which, I'm hoping to experience.
Well, the grief of having a terrible mother, like burnt sugar.
Yes. Yes.
मतलब grief तो बहुत सारे हैं.
Exactly.
I think of any good piece of writing that makes you feel anything, whether it's fiction or poetry. I think that's what all of us are kind of searching for. Poetry, I feel, as a form is therapeutic for both the writer and the reader. And maybe fiction is more, a process and a structure, and there's like there's several levels that you sort of pass to make sense of it. And I feel like poetry for me is just, it doesn't have to make sense. It can just flow and become something, as long as it's giving a feel of what I'm feeling, at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. And do you feel how we respond to loss and how we respond to grief, it's shaped by by the world in which we live in, cultural, societal, technological world that we live in?
So I'm the most recent, I would say. I don't know when everybody else has moved to I moved here 7 years ago. And it was a great cultural shock for me, because when one of my friends' fathers passed away, we received an email from another friend, please don't talk about it. Whereas my instinct was to go, gosh, bring groceries, flowers, everything. Like, don't talk about it. She was British. She is British. And I think I don't understand that. I just don't get it. And it brought in me that sort of like, when someone passes, then will nobody come to me? Because the thing that saves me every time a loved one passes away or something happens is the community that groups together, with all the bakwas that happens as well. But the food is there, they're here, they're holding you at least for the first 2 or 3 days. They are there for you. But the very clipped sort of almost like, don't talk to me, don't address it, I don't want to expose this. I have noticed this kind of difference and contrast. Naima, help.
You're absolutely right, Shazaf. But if we talk about grief, if we remove it from this situation, death hoti hai. I would say in our culture, I mean, I've experienced the death of both my parents-in-law, and there's so much expression, and I would say a lot of it is unnecessary. Also, there's so much expression around that, the passing of a person and the passing of an old person. I mean, was it a surprise? Did you not know it was going to happen? Of course you knew it, but there's a lot of staged element in that expression of grief. If we move it out of that situation and take it to, everyday grief or everyday losses, let me ask you, because I'm asking myself, do we learn in our culture to express it and share it in a healthy manner? Have our parents modeled that behavior? For me, the answer is no. I'm only learning to do it now, because I grew up with this notion that, you can't share, because as you said, all the bakwas that happens with the cultural, like, jo bhi hai, you never feel that somebody is, there to hold space for you.
The space of grief. Yeah, we like to close the space of grief in with ni sabr karo, ni Allah ka shukr, and this and this, and not letting the person stay in a space of grief, because that space of grief is uncharted, uncomfortable, and it cannot be signed away. Yeah, I agree with you.
Bilkul, Shazaf. And that's the beauty of it.
But the ritual is so important, because, okay, I'm Shia, and the whole matam and the wavela, oh my God, it's therapeutic, because if you have a formula by which to express. So, for example, when I was very, very sad, I used to go to a lot of majalis, because there was this period of hysterical wailing, and I was not wailing for any other reason than my personal grief, but that space of grief, that wailing, that crying, and that show of ritualistic emotion and devastation, it released me. It was a release. And I'm wondering, and a lot of people would find it very disturbing. So I think that if you throw away all ritual, all drama, you're perhaps doing yourself a disservice. But I also think that is one space, but some people, the processing of the emotions, the whys of what something happened, why did this happen to me, how do I get it, what is this landscape of grief, I mean, the ritual will help you segue into it, but when you're in it, that is the more problematic place to be in.
Shazaf, but do you think that sometimes one finds relief in going through the normal routine of somebody's life? For example, if a person goes through a divorce or some other form of grief, an event happens in your life that has put you under immense pain, grief, loss, and you decide to carry on the way things were, whether it's for your children, whether it's for your own sanity. Do you feel that, in South Asian culture or in our community, is it frowned upon, a loss of a husband, if a woman is stepping out for means of work, it's almost like it's an expectation to mourn, your grief, your divorce, that death or any event that has happened. Do you think that this is outlined by a cultural sort of expectation to perform, for the relatives? Or I mean, it's again, it's a question of how you process. It could be in the gestures, or in, like you said, in the formality of it, in the whether it's theatrical or whatever provides relief to you. But it could be like a different sort of expectation from oneself and others, how you choose to process grief.
No, that's a really good point. But I think what you bring through is about control of women, and that has nothing to do with grief.
Not just women. I mean, it could be I don't know, it could be a husband, but yes, I guess it's more towards,
I was told that you have to sit in that. No.
Yeah.
But yes, there is that element of control. And just what I think I'm trying to say is that that grief, to my understanding, is not a one-time event. There is the grief of what sometimes it's very latent, and it's a gift that keeps on giving, perhaps not in the nicest way. And I think that's where we are all failed with society. But in the initial shock of it, I find immense value in the ritualistic expression of it.
If I could just say two things, was Shazaf Abdukaring. One is, first of all, perhaps our writing is a way to ritualize. I feel that way, because for me, I've channeled most of my grief about my life through my writing, and that's what I teach, is about channeling, which is a sort of writing as a ritual. So I totally agree. Ritual is so necessary, and as we erode perhaps more and more rituals for socio-cultural, whatever progress, a lot of people return to just the writing. Like that guy you said, he was processing his grief. But dusri baat ye hai, and this will always happen with me, I will always come back to this, is that the loss of literary heritage, Urdu, Hindi. Hamare to, personally, I grew up with a person who was an author in Urdu, and he was always quoting Urdu poetry and all. And I feel like that is like a whole archive of grief, because we have been so good at expressing suffering, in my opinion, in our literary heritage. And I feel like the more we move away, because there used to be a song or a verse that you remember for every pain and every grief. And for me, I feel like returning to that could be actually very healing, because the socio-cultural stuff, it's all mixed up. Stiff upper lip, British, post-colonial, women, whatever, so much stuff.
But in A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis talks about the embarrassment of grief in this country, and that's what I think, that as if it's as if you have somehow failed if you've lost.
Yeah.
I don't understand that. Can someone explain that? Why? Perhaps I can, but can someone explain?
Stiff upper lip.
No, but how can it be an embarrassment or a personal failure to be sad about something? Naima, Safinah, what do you think?
I think the underlying thread, in all these concerns which have been expressed is, and once again, I'm not pretending that I have it back. No, I'm thinking as I speak. I feel the underlying concern is that there's a relationship between processing grief and the need for space. And only we each define what kind of space we need. It's an individual thing. I don't think a collective notion of rituals or a collective notion works for everyone. I mean, I respect where you're coming from, Shazaf, but I didn't grow up in that culture. So as you said that if you haven't grown up in that culture, or if you haven't grown up understanding that this ritualistic aspect or this expression can be healing, I found it very overwhelming and very disturbing. It was clearly not my way of processing. Similarly, what Safinah has just said about the performative aspect of grief, I feel that there is this expectation in our society, in our culture, that you are expected to behave a certain way after a loss. If during that time you laugh or, God forbid, sound normal or any of that, you're frowned upon. And so there is, I mean, once again, that raises the question of, should the space be dictated by a norm, by a culture, or society, or is it up to individuals to find their own space and their own way of healing with grief?
My question is, if you don't necessarily have a ritualistic or a socio-cultural space, which can be claustrophobic, I completely am on board with that. This personal, isolated processing of grief, is that grief processed? Is that grief? I mean, I'm just wondering, because I don't necessarily think that the privacy is so liberating either. It can be more isolating from what I have observed. This is why I think that C.S. Lewis wrote about A Grief Observed, is what is it that I'm going through? What is it that I'm not allowed to talk about? And writing that, by the way, that's my answer to my prose, the poetry and prose. That also is one of the things that set me free. Also, Atichi, she wrote Notes on Grief, didn't she, when her father passed away? And she talks about the physical sucker punch of finding out and, and of rediscovering every day, suddenly realizing that, oh, my father's not there. And I think it brings me back to, I think what's claustrophobic in our culture is the fact that you are the prescribed notion of ritualistic grief.
Exactly.
Right? Whereas if one of my cousins wants to talk about her deceased son years after, like 5 years after, if she's still grieving, then she'll be told, Acha, now you need to stop because it makes us uncomfortable. So I think, but that discomfort is very much found in British culture as well. Like, don't talk about it at all, right? I don't want to experience this landscape and this culture and I don't want to experience your pain. There's almost a disgust.
I think having grown up with white family and brown family, I can just say that these things are both true and untrue in my experience, because so with the Desi culture, yes, this line that you said, ki ab bahut ho gaya, ab nahi bolo, don't speak anymore, that really rang true. However, I find that in the white British culture, I have found sympathy for that kind of thing, where in the sort of contemporary understanding of things, that grief is a lifetime. Grief is an experience that has no termination, like sort of more in the spiritual, I won't say new age, but spiritual, and you can speak whenever you want about whatever you want. And, there's been an emergence of these death cafes. I don't know if you all are aware. And look, you can Google death cafe, and I think it's so healthy, and people just get together and speak about death. Because on the other side of it, wo jo Shazaf or Naima dono, you were saying about the repression in the British English thing, this is why they need death cafes, because they've never had these rituals of matam, or just even it's not even just Shia. I mean, I've seen plenty of Pakistani communities jahan matlab 40 din tak mourning hoti hai. That's quite a healthy thing, actually. If they
surrounded by people, I think it would be a
surrounded by people, yeah.
Also, do you think, when you say that, 40 din ho gaye, bas karo, ya 5 saal ho gaye, bas karo, it is because there's a vulnerability attached to grief, and people see it as a weakness as well in our society?
I think it stems from religion ki Allah ki raza ko aap kabool karo. You know,
Yeah, that's true.
somehow constantly talking about it, you've not accepted it. You see, and I think that's a misunderstanding, and I think it's incredibly cruel to say that to someone.
Yeah.
Incredibly cruel.
And I also feel like, grief doesn't have a timeline.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Everyone needs their own time to process and react to grief. And, it's almost like be damned if you do, be damned if you don't. ज़्यादा कर दे तो भी मसला है, कम करे तब भी मसला है, ज़्यादा क्यों खुश है, ज़्यादा क्यों गम है, So at any point, like if you go through an event, and I wouldn't even say death, any, lost time, like, somebody was saying, I personally had an event in my life. I, was a new bride. I broke my knee. Was really in my head. First year of marriage, all of that. And I heard a lot of, bas ab ho gaya na, matlab, move forward. And you're like, but it's physical pain, unless that pain gets cured, how do you move forward? But a lot of people, it makes people uncomfortable that a new bride is not happy, so it just kind of, I think it's about your circle being uncomfortable with things being imperfect, because they think that, a certain person should act a certain way, put in a certain situation. So ye aage piche ki ji, aage piche ki expectation is different from what one has to, be able to react to such a situation, So I think it's all about the stimuli you're getting from other people and what you're feeling inside. So somewhere, you have to draw a line and say that, this is my sort of way to deal with it. And I think society mein hamare ye bhi thoda sa ho jata hai.
I think also the textures of grief, because I was talking to someone, so I experienced divorce and my father's death at pretty much the same time, okay? And for me, my father's death was much easier to bear than the divorce, because I've written that divorce was like amputation without anesthesia.
Yeah.
Whereas Abba's death was something that God had sort of ordained, and I was able to make my peace with it. But the cruelty was that there was lots of space for me to cry for my father, but there was no space or sympathy to cry for a man I had lost, and a man who had walked away or whom I had walked away from, and there was judgment, you see. So I think the problem also, and I think that this is what I am trying to do when I write my third novel, is to talk about the nature of suffering of divorce. That even if you decide to leave, it is still devastating. Even if it is an empowered decision, it is still devastating. Very much like leaving your homeland for a new country. I felt amputated doubly, and then motherhood. Motherhood has its own stages of grief, doesn't it? How much do you lose? And I think that's really interesting, because I think that's where literature really serves us, where society fails us, because it talks about all those kinds of griefs where people will not talk about. People, they have a ritual for acha koi mar gaya, ye karna hai, right? But different kinds of sadnesses, the different textures. I think, and for me, I think poetry, literature, prose, and even the first-hand accounts of mothers who have lost, mothers or people who have lost devastating losses and lived to tell the tale and are still happy and surviving. Those are the space that's where literature is most powerful for me currently.
We'll have to wrap up in like 2 to 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
I'm done.
Okay.
Anybody else wants to say something?
Bas ye
We were just opening up.
It's a known grief. Oh, sorry. Divorce is a known grief. Matlab 100% agree with you. And also, when you have the children, then you can't exhibit your grief. I've had the same experience. And for me, it had to just happen through my writing, because I was alone with my child and I didn't want to disturb her with my grief.
You're still in the driving seat, you see.
Bilkul.
Ironically, it's a grief as well as, it's something, that can provide happiness as well for some. there was
After
a
the loss of grief. After
yeah,
it.
no, that's true. Well, what I'm going at is there was a placard displayed in Aurat March where and she's a writer, I think, and she wrote divorced and happy, and the backlash that she received.
Oh God.
So it's like, if you're grieving, somebody's going to say, why grieve? If you're happily divorced,
Mm.
that's enough.
Yeah.
But that's a question of liberation and
Yeah,
feminism, and that's a whole other thing, no?
Yes.
true. Any last words, everyone? Starting with alphabetically, Naima.
No, just this. I feel that my takeaway from this conversation is that there really is no one size fits all solution to processing and healing from grief. We were just talking about divorce, and I remember that my parents got divorced when I was a mother. So I was a mother, I had a son, and my parents got divorced. And it would seem like, on the face of it, it would seem like, okay, you're a grown up. What's the big deal? Your parents are getting divorced. I don't think I've ever recovered to this day. I don't think I've recovered from the pain of that, because that loss and the stage at which it came. Yes, I was a mother. Yes, I was a grown up, but you're still unprepared for it. So there's no one shade to grief. There's no one way to process it, and I think it's very cruel to make any assumption or give any prescriptions for anyone who's healing it. That just brings me back to the earlier point that we made about the importance of keeping and giving personal space in the context of grief.
Sascha?
I would just say that it seems like the underlying, what has come out a lot is that the impact of others on a process of grief. And essentially, grief is a very internal, personal, it's like no two griefs are the same. So I would just underline that it's society that can be the problem. But our own processing, it should go on. I feel like grief is a continuum, and having lost people, it's not a sorrow that goes away, and that's okay. Actually, I'm okay with that.
True. Safinah?
Again, I think I would just say there's no one formula, one reaction, one process, one, there is no one size fits all. There's no one box. Everyone has their own journey. Grief is an emotion. Everyone has to deal with at some point in their lives in some form. It's going to be a disservice if one is to recover from it too quickly, just to please people around. I think good reading, good writing does that for you. You hope to come across a text, a movie, a song that helps you, that releases some form of pain that you're feeling. But again, I think it's an occurrence that has to happen in everyone's life. So there is no one formula to deal with it.
Thank you. Shazaf?
I just find this entire conversation about grief incredibly healing. And I think that if we can just be, I think, like I said, it's the one common denominator. And I think that's really great, because people who think about grief and respond with a certain amount of silence, space, empathy, and understanding, and that requires very conscious presence. I think we can really save another person's life. I really do.
True.
It's happened to me. People have saved my life just by their presence. And I hope that, can continue to do the same through the words and through the presence and through just being.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for this amazing session. This is our second last session of the day of the event. So thank you so much, Naima, Sascha, Safinah, and Shazaf, for coming on board and sharing your thoughts on a topic that I think resonates with everyone, because all of us have found grief one way or the other. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you.
Bye.